Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragon's Jewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan. And I'm just going to get all those wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below. And if you like the content, please make sure you're hitting the like button on the videos. And of course, if you want to share some love down in the comments below, it's always greatly appreciated. And I absolutely love reading them. I do my best to make sure that I respond back and share some love in your direction as well, because naturally without you, this channel wouldn't exist. And I appreciate each and every one of you. And I thought I would bring some of those Halloween spooky vibes to the channel. There are going to be in the WIP and Chat style format, but I'm going to read some ghost stories of Alberta, which is the province that I reside in. So I will have a spooky canvas that I'll be working on, and then I'm going to read a couple of ghost stories so that you can listen along while you dab and paint, or work on another craft, or what you normally do during WIP and Chats kind of thing, and I keep you company with some spooky tales from my province. So I figured that would be fun. Arsonist brazenly stares from photograph. Chateau Lake Louise is a sister hotel to the Banff Springs Hotel. Sibling rivalry dictates that this beautiful old building should also hold bragging rights to a ghost. On one wall of the Chateau Lake Louise, there hangs a rare photograph. Rare because it includes the image of a ghost. It was taken during the fire of 1924 that all but destroyed the hotel. It was the second time the hotel had been threatened by fire. The photograph shows the fire raging in the background and onlookers in the foreground. Clearly depicted on the back of one of the onlookers' heads is a face. The hotel staff of that time maintained it was an image of a ghost they knew to be resident in the hotel. It was generally accepted that it was that ghost who had started the fire, and that he'd brazenly stayed to watch it burn, and even included himself in the photographs being taken of the catastrophe he'd caused. Chief lives on in College Plaza. Several years ago, Dr. Bill Moline, a professor of drama at the University of Alberta, lived in an apartment at College Plaza. The location, across the street from the campus, was ideal for him. He was a busy man with his acting and teaching, so the time saved by not having far to go to work was greatly appreciated. Despite this apparently ideal site, Dr. Moline did not live there for long. After playing a particularly challenging role one evening, Moline, exhausted, returned to his home, hoping to go directly to bed. Unfortunately, he didn't find the comfort he had been hoping for. On his way through the halls of College Plaza, Dr. Moline was stopped by an Indian brave. "You should not be here," the braided apparition told Moline. "This ground is sacred. My father was a brave warrior, and he is buried here." And then he was gone, leaving the tired Dr. Moline badly shaken and unable to fall into the sleep he had so looked forward to. Chief makes good his threat. People's fascination with ghosts and ghost stories become very apparent while I was researching this book. News media sometimes went to great lengths to get in touch with me, and tracking me down, a magazine's publisher's first call was to Alberta's government. From there, and within a few days of starting the search, the publisher had been given my number, and we had discussed the story he was interested in. If I'm ever looking for a diligent and resourceful researcher, he'll be my number one on my list. Another determined and successful group were the staff of the Homestretch radio show in Calgary. In CBC's
drive home program, and they'd been running a series of local ghost stories interspersed with music and traffic reports. Bev Oberg from the Homestretch show called me at noon one day. Her problem was rather an immediate one. Bev Oberg from the Homestretch show called me at noon one day. Her problem was rather an immediate one. They had scheduled an interview with an individual who had had an encounter with a ghost, just hours from airtime. The person changed his mind, afraid that his voice would be recognized and that he would be made fun of. Now Bev had empty airspace to fill. Could I be of help? I may have had more flattering invitations, but the story they wanted me to talk about is one of my favorites, the Dean House. Besides, I could certainly sympathize with their dilemma. Several times when I'd been following up on potentially exciting ghost stories, people had backed down on their original plan of sharing their stories with me. I could readily empathize with the feeling of frustration. Bev gave me a couple of hours to get ready and then called me back. I did the interview with the show's host, Jeff Collins, by phone early that afternoon for broadcast at the appropriate time slot. All went well. Actually, all went better than well, because while I was being interviewed, Jeff gave me a piece of information that helped me to solve one of the riddles in the Dean House story. I told him about the guest being confronted by the old Indian in the basement during one of the murder mystery nights held at the Dean House. I can tell you who that was, Jeff asserted, and then continued, that was Deerfoot. He was a powerful Indian chief in the Calgary area. Before he died, he warned that he would wreak death and destruction on white men in retaliation for their treatment of his people. Can you imagine that after a threat like that, the city named a high-speed roadway after the chief? That road has had more than its share of personal injury and fatality accidents. If you have ever driven on Calgary's Deerfoot Trail, you may well be as suspicious as I am that the ghost of Chief Deerfoot has made good on his threat. Ellen Hopkins tells a story. The original edition of this classic haunted house yarn is a handwritten document. A teenage girl artistically scripted the pages that began with a letter written on Christmas Eve 1945 and addressed to the Alberta Folklore Quarterly. To change even a word of the young woman's manuscript would lessen its value. It was recorded here exactly as Ellen Hopkins wrote it. Alberta Folklore Quarterly, University of Alberta. Gentlemen, I have written here a story which has been told and retold by my late grandparents and my uncles who staunchly declared every word of it to be the truth. I hope you will consider it suitable for publication, and if you do, would you send me a copy of the issue of your paper it is in? I am a grade X correspondence student. Sincerely, Miss Ellen Hopkins, 15 years of age. In 1890, my grandfather, Louis Irvin, and his bride of 1 year, with their tiny daughter Ellen, decided that times were too hard and chances of making a living too slim to remain in their child home of Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Having heard wonderful tales of free land and chickens running wild for the taking in Midwestern Alberta, they packed their belongings along with great-grandmother and great-grandfather Archer, uncles Zeke and Jonah, and their household effects, and moved to what is now the city of Edmonton. At that time, it consisted of one frame house, a cottage overlooking what is now the Mount Pleasant Cemetery, and several other places of business and smaller private homes. In South Edmonton, there was only a ford crossing of the river below the old low-level bridge. The aforementioned frame house was considered quite a luxurious dwelling in that district at the time. But alas, for some strange reason, there was no one living in it, nor had there been for some time. On a chill November day, the Irvins and Archers arrived into the little settlement in search of a house in which to rest their travel-weary bones. The gentlemen of the party left the ladies in charge of the baggage while they set off to find said dwelling. The first gentleman questioned informed them that there was a dandy frame house, empty for anyone's use who cared to move in, and best of all, no rent was required. Upon questioning the good man further, the ancestors found that the man had lived in it some time ago with his flighty wife. This man had been ill, and every night his wife would go out to meet a lover and leave him walking the floor and moaning piteously in his agony until she returned. Then suddenly one day the wife packed in a hurry and left, saying only that her husband had died and was buried on the hill. Soon after, a family had moved into the vacant house and moved out after a brief stay of 2 days, saying that the house was haunted. Grandfather scoffed at the tale, and though the rest of the family were rather skeptical, had them moved in before they knew it. The first night the travelers slept well, and the next day much time was spent in scoffing at superstitious neighbors and their grandmother's tales. But alas, the following night at 12 sharp, thud thump, across the attic floor. It was a windy evening, and eerie moans were heard, interspersed by clanking of the chains being drawn across the floor. Thud thump, eek, clank clank. The spirit was abroad. Grandmother shot bolt upright in bed and clawed the air wildly, her elbow winding up in Grandpa's solar plex, which aroused him out of a deep sleep and set him gasping for air. Sure, and what is it that ye be knocking me thud, thump, clank, yee? Grandpa slid like an eel into the feather tick, burying it up to his ears. What was that? Grandmother was too frightened to answer, and the rest of the night was spent in listening to the noises overhead until the wind went down and the sun arose in all its glory. That morning, a group of white-faced Irish Americans, after exchanging "Did you hear it?" hit upon a plan. That afternoon, Grandpa took a bag of flour and went upstairs. He sprinkled the flour on the floor and left feeling quite smug. That night, the wind came up again, howling about the loose shutters and tearing through the barren branches of the big trees behind the little cottage on Mount Pleasant. And soon, to the waiting ears of the settlers again came the weird sounds of a man in agony, dragging chains across the upper floor and moaning in agony all the while. This continued until 3, and suddenly, to the already terrified listeners, although I fancy Grandpa's Irish blue eyes were twinkling with fun, came sounds of the piano in the parlor being played. Uncle Zeke could almost see the ghostly fingers trailing up and down the keys. Thump, the music stopped. Another morning rolled around, and it was with some difficulty that Grandfather persuaded the family to stay but another day. That evening, the men were returning from town when Uncle Jonah happened to turn and look down the hill. Rolling up the hill toward them were 3 balls of fire, glowing vividly in the dark. That was enough. Jonah threw his hands up and told his brothers, "Boys, 'tis a warning, sure, and I'm sure of it." The next morning, the frame house was again vacant, but not for long. An English family by the name of Bissett moved in at noon, and at night they moved out, after summoning Louis Irvin to board up the windows. This he did, and as they were about to leave, he asked Miss Bissett why they were leaving so soon. For answer, she took him inside the house and opened the cellar door. From out of the cellar came an unholy stench. Grandpa Irvin was never a superstitious man, but for some reason that smell made the hair rise straight up on his skull. No one had ever lived in that house again, but perhaps the restless spirit. Grandpa never would believe the rest when they tried to tell him 'twas a ghost had done all the mischief. He always said that when he went to board up the windows, he found a loose shutter, which, when banged against the house in the wind, made the thumping noises, for the flour on the floor was undisturbed. The wind howling in an empty bottle made the eerie moaning, and was also the wind rattling the harness in the shed, making the clanking noise. The piano had been played by a tomcat, running over the keys several times and leaping to the floor with a thump. Several years later, he heard some stories of phosphorant wood glowing in the dark, and thought it might well be that rolled up the hill by the wind which had frightened them. But as for the smell from the cellar, it may have been a skunk. But well, somehow even Grandpa doesn't think so. So it's possible that this is where Mount Pleasant Cemetery got its name, and my ancestors got a huge scare, and somehow I think a lot of fun. By Ellen Hopkins. Sweat Lodge endures. Long before Europeans settled in Alberta, people with a firm belief in the supernatural resided here. The following stories found their way to this author, but I'd be surprised if there weren't many more. In 1969, the proposed stretch of the Thompson Highway between Rocky Mountain House and Nordegg was surveyed. One of the surveyors discovered a small native sweat lodge hidden in the long summer grass. It had been well built. The stone walls were standing, and only the willow branches that had been the roof lay broken and weathered inside the sweat lodge. Under the branches was a small pile of rocks that may have been the stones that had been heated to make the steam. The surveyor knew the structure would be destroyed during the road construction, but he noted it on his drawings anyway. The next year, road building equipment moved in, and the sweat lodge was apparently demolished. In the summer of 1971, a group of university students came to survey the highway. One of the students noticed the notes about the abandoned sweat lodge on the original map. When they reached that area of the highway, the student went to see if there was anything left. His hunt was rewarded. Hidden in the long summer grasses, he found a sweat lodge. It had been carefully built with strong stone walls. The willow roof lay broken inside, bearing a small pile of stones. Strange Stories from Camrose. Touring the province and stopping to chat has proved to be a rewarding way to turn up strange tales. While enjoying the beautiful area around Camrose, a country worker added the following 2 stories to the collection. In 1910, a wealthy Englishman arrived in the Camrose area. He was newly married and intended to settle in this picturesque Alberta community. Because his bride was used to the best, he built a big 2-story home in preparation for her arrival. When it was complete, he sent for her, and the young woman made her way by ship and train to her husband's side. The bride's reaction to her new home was swift and sure. She hated everything about it, and refused to even spend a night in the home her husband had labored to build. Devastated, the man returned to England with his wife. He left the house just as it stood. No information was left about when he'd return or what he wanted to do with the residence. Years passed and the house stood empty. No one ever heard from the Englishman again. His house, however, began to take on a life of its own. Neighbors observed lights going on and off in the bedroom windows. Soon, the whole town accepted the eccentric English couple's abandoned home as being haunted. It was presumed that by now the man had died and had come in death to live where he intended to years before. The house was eventually claimed for unpaid taxes. Despite this, it wasn't torn down. The activity in the windows of the always empty house continued. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the lot and house were purchased by a developer. By the time the once stately and imposing residence was torn down, it was sadly dilapidated. It had never served its original purpose. Maybe. The second tale from the country of Camrose took place more recently in the early 1970s. At the time, a couple with 6 children settled on a farm near Edinburgh. They were a hard-working family who did not bother much with neighbors or socializing. The children did, though, attend a local school and were able here to have some fun and make some friends. More than a year after they moved to the area, the children's teachers were surprised to find all the brothers and sisters absent from school one day. It was presumed that they were kept home to help with the chores. When none of the children appeared for several days, surprise turned to concern, and an official of the school was sent to the family home to investigate. No one was at home when the official arrived. By peering through windows, he could see that they had not moved, but were merely away. All the furniture was still in the house, and the place was scrumptiously clean and orderly. There was little anyone could do except wait for the day the family returned from their unexpected holiday. Nearly 20 years have passed, and that day has not yet come. Not one member of the self-isolated family has ever been seen since. For all intents and purposes, 8 people vanished in the 1970s from rural central Alberta. That in itself is a strange tale. But what makes it stranger still is the house the 6 children and their parents left behind. Up till the mid-1980s, the house still existed, abandoned. No one remembers the land being sold or the dwelling being torn down, as it may well still exist. Its exact location has been forgotten by area residents, and today the place is confused with a number of abandoned farmhouses. If you did happen upon it, though, there is one way you'd know for sure you'd found the right homestead. Despite the years of abandonment, the interior of this house apparently remains immaculate, as clean and tidy as the day the owners left it, with no one seen going in or out. Leader rides again. Chief White Eagle of the Stoney tribe led his people away from attacks to the safety of what is, today, the Morley area of Alberta. In his lifetime, he was gratified to see that his choice of location was a wise one. His people prospered in the area he'd led them to. Still, the defeat of his people by their enemies, the Cree and the Blackfoot tribes, was a humiliation White Eagle could never accept. He wanted revenge. Oddly, in death, White Eagle found his satisfaction and retaliation. Mortally injured in a further attack, the brave chief ordered his warriors to bury him at the peak of a nearby mountain. As the younger men prepared the grave for their dying leader, they caused an avalanche of stones to cascade down the mountainside and kill the attacking tribes. The revenge was so sweet to White Eagle that even today he revels in his coup. Legend has it that White Eagle, dressed in flowing robe, rides his white stallion, accompanied by his white dog, through the mist of the Ghost Hills mountain, and then disappears until the next season into the side of Devil's Head Mountain. Hotel hosts the famous and the dead. So many ghost stories surround the Banff Springs Hotel, that it is difficult to know where to begin. Perhaps this is why the hotel's public relations department have now decided that, officially, the place is not haunted. A few years ago, the staff spoke openly to the media of many strange and unearthly tales. Fortunately for ghost hunters, these were carefully documented at the time. The building was originally constructed in 1888, but even the Canadian Pacific Railway's far-sighted William Van Horn had not been able to predict the enormous popularity of the resort. By the early 1900s, several wings had been added to the hotel to keep up with the demand for accommodation. During construction, one of these wings, an error was made. A room with neither doors nor windows was included in the addition. Hastily, the architects altered the blueprints to cover their error. It was not discovered until a fire in the hotel in 1926. The secret room was noted during the cleaning up process after the fire. What was more intriguing than the room itself, though, was its location. The hallway outside the boarded-up room had been the scene of many reported strange going-ons. Security guards had frequently noted a shadowy figure lurking in the area. Perhaps the architect who had made the mistake was so haunted by his error in life that he returned to haunt the hotel in death. The missing room was removed during the renovations necessary to repair the fire damage, and that particular ghost has not been seen since. The most accepted ghost of the Banff Springs Hotel is that of Samuel Macaulay. Sam was a Scotsman who arrived at the resort in the 1930s to work as a porter. He stayed on for over 40 years, and some say he's there still. Sam himself assured anyone and everyone that in death he would return to haunt the hotel. Guests regularly mentioned seeing light shining just outside their windows. The rooms these reports originate from are well above ground level and are located where there are no ledges for anyone to stand on. One couple checked in late in the evening, and the next day they inquired as to who the old man was who had helped them with their bags the night before. The hotel employee assured them that there were no bellhops over the age of 30 at the Banff Springs. But the couple were insistent. They even described the man. They were describing Sam Macaulay. He had been dead for 2 years by that time. Sam's favorite haunt is the 9th floor of the castle-like structure. Legend has it that Sam hid a goodly percentage of his tips up there, and that he's come back to protect his money. Whatever his reasons may be, the former employee has certainly kept his word about haunting the hotel. If Sam ever gets lonely at the Banff Springs, he just needs to visit the resort's Rob Roy Lounge. Here, numerous ghosts have been sighted over the years. These include the ghost of a bride who died after a fall down the hotel's staircase, a headless bagpiper, and a long-deceased bartender who takes it upon himself to inform patrons when they've had enough to drink. Those are the apparitions that have been in the lounge. Others exist, but have only been heard. These include a male voice that is heard singing to the ladies' washroom at an unlikely hour of 3 a.m., and a male chorus that is sometimes heard in the men's washroom. The Mackenzie Room is another area of the hotel credited with having a ghost. There is a picture of the room's namesake hanging on the wall, and it said his spirit comes out of the eyes of the portrait. The ghost is widely believed to be linked to the 1946 fire in the north wing of the hotel. Most of the guests at Banff Springs Hotel enjoy the ghost stories that come along with their beautiful surroundings. There is one young man, though, who will probably never return. The Minnesota North Stars hockey team stayed a night in the inn. All the players had heard the ghost stories, but of course were far too macho to be frightened. All except one rookie, that is. His roommate for the night hid under the rookie's bed, and as the young man dropped off to sleep, reached up and grabbed his leg. The older player got the reaction he wanted and laughed as he listened to his teammate screaming down the hallway. What would the rookie have done if an elderly porter had approached him to ask what was the matter? Some people more haunted than others. Gail's story certainly adds weight to the theory that it is people, not places, that are haunted. She had asked only to be identified by her first name. The year was 1977. Gail and her husband headed out of town for a much-needed and long overdue vacation. They had planned and looked forward to this time away. It was to be one of those breaks from routine that would be remembered for a lifetime. I just couldn't relax, even as we were starting out, Gail began. I had such an uneasy feeling that there was something wrong. Gail's tension soon affected her husband's mood as well. Hoping that the feelings would diminish as they drove, the young couple continued to head for their intended destination. Distance from home did nothing to lessen the all-pervasive feelings of doom. They persevered, but 2 weeks later returned from the disappointing trip feeling worse than when they'd left. On the way back, we stopped and called my husband's family. It was then that we learned that his cousin, who was also a very close friend, had been killed in a car accident the day after we left, Gail recalled, the emotion still evident in her voice even after all these years. Knowing how desperately the two had needed their vacation, Gail's in-laws had not contacted them about the tragedy. They felt the bad news could wait until the couple's return. The well-meaning family did not take into account Gail's extreme sensitivity. As soon as I heard, I knew that it was Chris's death that had caused my feelings. We were so fond of him. He was just a young man. I felt deprived of the chance to say goodbye to him. I cried for a month. Gail paused to compose herself before continuing. In bed one evening, I felt someone staring at me. I didn't see or hear him, but I knew it was Chris. It was as if he was saying, "Don't be so sad, I'm happy where I am." As a recently deceased person's visit often does, Chris's words were reassuring to Gail. After his appearance, she was finally able to get on with her life. Chris, however, apparently continued to keep a special watch over Gail. A couple of years later, a man who had known Chris moved to the city. Steve began coming around and phoning frequently. Neither my husband nor myself were comfortable with him. There was just something about the fellow that we didn't like. One Saturday afternoon, the phone rang. When I picked it up, the line was full of static. I kept saying hello and asking if there was anyone there, but all I could hear was static. As I started to put the receiver down, the disconnect button began going up and down. Fascinated, the woman watched until the button finally remained still. She could hardly believe her eyes. "Do it again," she ordered the unseen force. It did. When the button stopped moving for a second time, Gail's kitchen cupboard doors began to open and close with a will of their own. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was Steve. I'm convinced to this day that it was Chris who had caused all the strange activity. He was trying to warn me. I didn't let Steve in that day, nor have I ever since. As a matter of fact, it's been years since we've even heard from him. That may not have been the last time Chris visited Gail. In 1979, there was another incident which she suspects was Chris's presence. Again, I felt someone watching me. I looked up, and in the corner of the living room, there was a glowing white light. It was straight up and down. As I stared at it, I felt wonderfully reassured. Then it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. It may well have been Chris's vigilance that kept Gail from a serious car accident. She was driving home late one night after visiting with her father. The route she took included the stretch of Grote Road in Edmonton, leading to the River Valley area. The road twists and turns as it makes its way down the hill. It was very late and there was little traffic. In keeping with a long-standing habit, Gail was driving in the left lane. Something was telling me to change lanes, to get into the right lane. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't ignore it. As soon as I did, I rounded another curve, and there in the left lane was an abandoned car with no lights on. It was just sitting there. If I hadn't changed lanes, I would have crashed into it full force. With some justification, Gail wonders if it was Chris's spirit guarding her. Later that same year, Gail had another experience. This one definitely did not involve Chris. Gail readily admitted the incident. It scared the hell out of me. She awakened in the middle of the night from a deep sleep. My first waking thought was that a cat was crawling up the bed. Then I felt as though something was trying to take over my body. I cried out, "God help me," and instantly I was surrounded by a white light. Unable to get back to sleep, Gail wandered aimlessly through the apartment until morning. Shortly after daybreak, a neighbor came to report that there had been a suicide in the building the night before. It had happened at the time of Gail's terrifying experience. As soon as I heard about the man's death, I knew what had caused my terror. In retrospect, I'm sure that he didn't really want to kill himself. He changed his mind, but it was too late. It was months before Gail recuperated from her experience. Since these incidents, the couple had moved. As they were settling into their new place, her husband wondered out loud if the spirits would follow them. Just a few days later, as Gail was sitting at her kitchen table reading, his question was answered. The table began to move as though someone were shaking it. My son and I both watched it happen. When the violent movements stopped, Gail and the boys stared at each other in disbelief. "Do it again," she commanded the table, and as she had done to the phone, the table began to move of its own accord once more. "I guess that answered our question," Gail conceded. Tracks lead nowhere. Years before European settlers arrived, the land that is now Waterton National Park was sacred to the natives. It is a windy area, and the Aboriginal residents thought that when the wind died down, the Great Spirit walked the land. One winter, a hunting party of young warriors was caught in an unexpected storm. They sought refuge in the large evergreens that grew on the slopes of the mountains surrounding Waterton Lake. It was 9 days before the storm abated, and by that time, all but 2 of the native hunters had died. When it seemed safe, the survivors left the sheltering trees and walked along the shoreline toward their village. They hadn't gone far when wind and snow began again. This time, the men hid in a small cave in the side of the mountain. Their food had run out, and the supply of wood for fires was dangerously low. When the younger of the 2 warriors became ill, the older one realized they would both die unless he took action. He fashioned a pair of snowshoes as best as he could from the remaining wood and buckskin cut from their clothing. Carrying his sick companion, the warrior headed out across the lake. He hoped the frozen lake would hold their combined weight. Not long after he started out, the snow stopped falling and the winds died. Everything became very still and cold. The warrior knew the Great Spirit was walking with him. Despite this, the man's strength was completely drained, and he knew he would not make it back to the village. The warrior continued as best as he was able, his friend over his shoulder, singing praises to the spirit who was at his side. The storm ended, and a group from the village began a search for their missing warriors. They found those who had died on the mountain slope. After a careful search, they found the prints of snowshoes leading to the middle of the lake. The winds were filling the tracks with freshly fallen snow, but the group was able to follow the path. Without warning, the tracks ended. There was no hole in the ice, nor any bodies at the end of the snowshoe tracks. The imprints they had been following simply stopped. The mystery of what became of their fellow villagers was never solved. The two who had survived the first days of the vicious storm had disappeared. It is said that after an early storm in November, if the winds died down and you know where to look, you can see the tracks of the snowshoes heading across the lake and hear the soft sound of chanting, as though a warrior were praising the Great Spirit.